Hi, welcome back to Study Hall. My name is Jill Zamorsky, and on this series, I share tips and tricks, little hints, and things that I developed for myself to help me in my pursuit of beverage certifications. And I've pursued certifications through both the Court of Master Sommeliers and the Wine and Spirits Education Trust. And we're gonna do something a little different today. We are back in my kitchen, and today I want to talk about spirits and cocktails. Now, I know this is Somm TV, not Cocktail TV, but if you work in the hospitality industry, if you enjoy beverage alcohol, if you are planning on taking some sort of beverage alcohol certification, this might be a little bit helpful for you. Now, I will say, depending on the level of the exam that you might be preparing for, some of this stuff may be applicable and some of it might not be, but I think it's generally some good information. An additional point of note is the WSET has now separated wine and spirits out into separate curricula. So they used to be combined, but now there's the spirits program and there is the wine program, and I actually teach courses for both of those. And so this is some information that I think is important. One of the fun things about learning about cocktails and spirits is even if you're not a huge fan or drinker of cocktails and spirits, it's a very affordable thing to study. And what I mean by that is, yes, there is some equipment involved, but spirits, unlike wine, are gonna be shelf stable once open. So if you do invest in something, you can feel good about investing in a quality product, because once you crack that cap, it's not gonna go bad in a matter of days. In fact, it's gonna be good for a while. When I was studying for, I guess, the advanced and the Master Sommelier exam, I made a whole separate kind of segment of my studying to focus on spirits and cocktails. And this is actually going to be a two-part kind of take on cocktails and spirits. And for this first part, I want to address sort of the idea of the theory of understanding spirits and cocktails. Don't worry, we'll get to the drinking part. That certainly is the nice reward for learning how to make cocktails and understanding how spirits are produced. But there is a theoretical aspect. And of course, with the Court of Master Sommeliers, the exams are broken down into a theoretical aspect, a service or practical aspect, and then also a tasting aspect. And all of those things are germane to spirits. So when it comes to the theory part, a lot of us use note cards when we're studying, and I did too. I actually preferred to use a note card app on my phone rather than writing out note cards, but whatever your preference is completely fine. Spirits, of course, are, distilled beverages. And when we talk about spirits at a very basic level, the most important thing to understand is what distinguishes spirits are the base material and how it's processed, what happens during fermentation, what happens during distillation, and then finally what happens after, sort of the aging process, if in fact there is an aging process. But let's start at the very beginning. And there are different and fundamental categories of spirits. And I know that you could name them all, but I could tick off a few on my hands. Bourbon, cognac, tequila, mezcal, vodka, gin. I mean, there's lots of them, right? So if we start at the very beginning of that, pick a category. Let's say bourbon, right? So the first step would be understanding that spirit. What rules and regulations surround that spirit? What does it have to be made of? In bourbon's case, minimum 51% corn. But there are other cereal grains that can be used in the production of bourbon. And if we go back to the 4 steps of what distinguishes different spirits, the raw material, those cereal grains, the percentages of them are going to have a big effect on the final profile of a particular bourbon. Then you need to understand the process by which this spirit is made. And then any other rules and regulations. I talk about bourbon because it was just the Kentucky Derby, it was just Derby Day, and mint juleps are the cocktail of choice for that. And a lot of people feel, and maybe some folks out there, believe that bourbon has to come from Kentucky, and that's not true. It can come from anywhere. It just happens that a lot of it does come from Kentucky. So it's important to understand the rules, the laws, and the regulations. And then where do we go from there? Well, what if I asked you, can you name 3 different bourbons from 3 different producers from 3 different states? Because it doesn't all come from Kentucky. And you could make a flashcard to that effect. What if you were in a suggestive selling situation, either in your place of work or in an exam, and somebody asked for a bourbon-based cocktail in a service scenario. You might have offered a mint julep. What if they don't want that? What if the bartender ran out of mint? What if any number of, situations came up? Can you name another bourbon-based cocktail? And what about another? Now, one thing about this is you don't have to get crazy complicated. There are lots of what we call classic cocktails out there. You could pick up any cocktail book off the shelf. Shameless self-promotion here, I reviewed a really good one in my podcast, Reading and Drinking. But you could pick up a cocktail book anywhere and it's gonna list classic cocktails with all these major spirits as the base spirit. And so I think it's important to have a couple of different cocktails per spirit kind of in your back pocket, as it were. Not just different styles of cocktails, but also what I like to call laterals. And I've used this term talking about wine before. And it's this idea that when we talk about wine for blind tasting, laterals to me is like wines that could be easily confused for each other because they have several things in common. And the same thing can be true with cocktails. If, for instance, you like a sidecar, which has cognac as a base, you're probably gonna like a daiquiri, which has rum as a base. You might also like a margarita, which has tequila as a base. And if you look at those cocktails, no poetic riffs, on the recipe, but the classic base recipe, they have a lot in common. Similar proportions of ingredients and similar actual ingredients. The citrus component might be lemon versus lime. You might have rum versus tequila, but the general profile of that drink in terms of how it's served and its, sweet to tangy or sour ratio to strong ratio is gonna be similar. And so it's good to have laterals. If, for example, going back to our bourbon discussion, you like a Manhattan, which is one of my favorite cocktails. Well, can you think of some riffs on a Manhattan, classic drinks, that would be a good recommendation? Or alternatively, are there other classic cocktails that are very similar to a Manhattan, like a Rob Roy, which has scotch instead of bourbon as the base, that you could then make as a recommendation? So this is sort of the theoretical aspect of understanding cocktails. Now, I think the more you understand the basics, the more familiar you will be with them. But that's just for spirits, and we've talked about recipes for cocktails. And I'll tell you what I did when I was practicing this. I made my lists of the major cocktails, and then I made kind of a collection of classic cocktails, and I wrote out the recipes on Post-it notes. And I love a thrifty study technique, and look, Post-it notes, they're not expensive, right? And so what I would do, because studying occasionally has its perks, is I would pick a different color of Post-it note for a different base spirit. And I would write out longhand the recipe for a cocktail. Say blue is my vodka note. And I would make 3 or 4 different recipes for vodka-based cocktails. And then just, short little snippet of studying, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I would write out the recipe because writing things down helps you remember. That's a great study tip. But then I would actually make the drink. And then that Post-it, it made its way onto my kitchen cabinet. So if I was going into the kitchen to make coffee, I would just happen to see my Post-it notes with the recipes for vodka-based cocktails. They were just there, and it would be some passive absorption of that information. And so to that end, you have to understand how the spirit is made. Maybe you have some different producers. I should also mention, you should know how much those bottles, those spirits cost. And you know how you figure that out? You just walk into a store, a liquor store or a wine shop, and just take a look at the shelf. Cruise down the aisle for those different spirits and just mentally make a note. Because one thing that we talk about a lot with the Court of Master Sommeliers is this idea of the business of the sommelier. So if a bottle of bourbon costs X number of dollars, you can look right on the label and see what the volume of that bottle is, whether it's, a 750 milliliter bottle or if it is a liter bottle, and you can calculate what the cost per ounce is. Because I've been asked on previous exams before to cost out a cocktail. And so you have that information and you have to know what the recipe is and how much it costs, and you can break it all down. And if you know how much a cocktail costs, then you can reasonably understand how much it should be sold for. Over the past year, a lot of us probably drank a little bit more than usual because we were home a lot more and we weren't going out to bars and restaurants. And I think it's really important to understand the build of a cocktail, the proper way to make it, And when I'm at home, I don't always do that. I think I joked on a podcast that sometimes I would make a Manhattan and I might just eyeball it. I would free pour the bourbon and the vermouth and I might even stir it with my finger. You would obviously never do that in a professional setting. You would definitely never do that in an exam setting. So it's very important to understand just the measurements, but also the technique behind what goes into doing that. You should know that a classic cocktail, how it should be served and what those terms mean. Is it supposed to be served on the rocks? In which case it should be poured over ice. It should be served over ice. Should it be served neat? In that case, it's just the spirit as is, not chilled. Should it be served up? It should be chilled and served in a glass that has a stem, but there should be no ice in the glass. And the different types of glasses, go to a thrift store, order them online. There's no right or wrong place where you can get them, but again, get as much as you're comfortable with. And if you live by yourself, get one of each. That's completely fine. But I think it's important to practice the build and actually making these cocktails, because if you're called on to do that in a spirit or a sommelier exam, then you've got that practice down. And of course, then you also get to drink the cocktail at the end so you know what it tastes like. And you can kind of tweak the recipe and work from there. So you'll notice I haven't even opened a bottle. We haven't had a sip of anything to drink, but there's a lot of kind of theoretical work that you can do in the meantime to prepare yourself to be more successful for an exam that focuses on spirits or cocktails.